Today, we welcome to Global Citizenship Education Interview Series, Mark Olssen. Mark Olssen is Emeritus Professor of Political Theory and Educational Policy in the Department of Politics at the University of Surrey. His philosophically inspired sociology is known worldwide, and it has brought him followers across the world. His work has supplemented postmodern philosophy by drawing on the work of Foucault and others. Olssen's writings have enhanced our understanding of Michel Foucault's theory and underpinnings and contributed to the critique of 20th century liberal political theory. His more recent and widely read books are Liberalism, Neoliberalism, Social Democracy, The Communitarian Perspectives on Political Philosophy and Education, 2010, and Towards a Global Think Community, Nietzsche, Foucault, and the Cosmopolitan Commitment, 2009. So, of course, this is an essential biography, Mark, but it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this interview series because I believe that your work seriously and critically address very important themes for today's society. In this interview series, of course, we will discuss cosmopolitan perspectives, we will discuss the notion of global citizenship and many other important themes. So I want to thank you because this is going to be a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be with you.
Thank you, Mark. So let me begin with a very straightforward question. The question is, what is cosmopolitan and global citizenship education in the era of neoliberal globalization, in your opinion?
Well, it really attests to the importance of the global today and the fact that we're all global citizens in a sense that perhaps we weren't 30 or 40 years ago even, but certainly a century ago. We face huge expanding problems today that previously generations have not had to deal with. And neoliberalism has been the engine, if you like, of the global cosmopolitan initiative. It's had both benefits and disadvantages, but the disadvantages are certainly considerable. Neoliberalism has fueled things like inequality on a world scale. It's one of the engines of climate change. It's really the motor of capitalism in our present time. It's also, I believe, contributed to global pandemics that are now confronting us. Citizens today are increasingly global, and what they do affects the global. For example, when we use plastic, it affects climate change, it affects the environment. When we drive cars, it does the same thing. So the local and the global are combined in a way that we never really understood before. Neoliberalism has generated a huge number of disadvantages. One of these is huge inequalities between rich and poor. Others are crises which the global neoliberals are themselves not seeing themselves as responsible to fix.
Right. Very interesting. And I believe there is a connection here with the important work that you're advancing and your life journey as an educator. So my second question here is how what you just said connects in a way to your life journey as an intellectual who is popular worldwide.
Okay, I started life as a young academic doing a PhD at Otago University in New Zealand, and I got a scholarship to Essex University in the United Kingdom, where I went to do my PhD. I was, say, halfway through that PhD when a job came up back at Otago University, and I applied for it and ended up in the Department of Education in the School of Arts at Otago University in New Zealand. There I I started to lecture on the sociology of education. I lectured on the Basil Bernstein, Michael Young, Michael Apple, Stephen Ball. I taught on Foucault in the Faculty of Education. That's where I first became interested in the work of Foucault, and started reading him avidly. So I taught there for about 20 years, and Otago restructured in 2000. I retained my job, but it was a demoralizing exercise, to say the least. And I applied to the University of Surrey in England for a position, and I got it. They rang me up at 2 a.m. in the morning, not being particularly sensitive to time zone differences. And that was the start of a new career. I flew over for the interview. I got the job, and I went to join the School of Education at the University of Surrey. Now, after a few years, Surrey announced they were going out of education and setting up the School of Politics, or the Department of Politics, rather, in the School of Social Sciences. And I was asked whether I'd like to go into that. So I joined the Department of Politics from about 2007, 2008. And I've been in the Department of Politics at the University of Surrey ever since. So in a sense, I'm in two departments. I'm in both politics and I'm in education. I see myself equally committed to both. I've been to conferences in education, many, of course, and I've been to conferences in politics in Britain and in Europe. And it's quite possible to be in two disciplines, I've found.
Yeah.
Very postmodern, as someone once pointed out, but I see both as important, and I'm equally committed to both. So I went emeritus professor after my wife died, and I went emeritus professor in 2016, but have remained active in research.
Right. In fact, you are publishing very interesting work, and I believe the intersection of politics and education is evident in your writings. That's why very, very much grateful that we are having this discussion, because in this interview series, in a way, there is always an intersection between philosophy, politics, and education. And this is, I believe, one of the strengths of this series. And here I'd like to mention and to quote perhaps one of your recent writings, where you say that the cosmopolitan ideal expresses some important insights, yet the approach needs serious modification because it fails to address global justice. Can you elaborate on this? This is a very essential notion that you are sharing here through your writings.
Yes, I think harnessed to neoliberalism, cosmopolitanism has failed many people, and you're seeing this in the rise of extreme politics in Europe and elsewhere. You're seeing the rise of anti-immigration, of nationalist, extreme nationalist politics. You're seeing also, I believe, the erosion of democracy, and in recent years, the rise of authoritarian politics in many, many countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in Russia, China, and many countries. So in this sense, the neoliberal engine has not actually produced global justice for all. It's produced a rampant inequality, and many people have difficulty identifying with the benefits, I think, of cosmopolitanism. Which is why I think also you've had a phenomenon like Brexit, where the country is more or less equally divided. The vote for Brexit was 52% versus 48%. And a lot of people were disenchanted with the European experiment and wanted a more nationalist future. And I think this has become a problem for cosmopolitanism. Capitalism has not proved a very good model for growth going forward. And it will have to become much more social democratic, I believe, if it's going to solve many of the problems that are facing people today. So far, it's relied on things like philanthropy of people like Bill Gates and other rich people, but it's questionable as to how effective that is and whether philanthropy itself constitutes an adequate basis for big capitalists sharing their wealth. I mean, to some extent, many of them are involved more in space exploration. It's not quite clear how this helps redistribute wealth or help solve the problems that many in the world are actually facing. So old models are not suitable is one refrain that we could repeat here. Neoliberalism, in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, I think you could list a large number of things that neoliberalism fails to deliver on. And that I think has derailed the cosmopolitan initiative to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. So if we're going to shift this complex background that you just outlined here into notions, for example, related to, what does it mean? What are the challenges for the notion of global citizen and global citizens today? How would you apply what you just said in our discussion as it relates, for example, to notions of global citizenship? And then later we will also discuss your interpretation of Foucault that perhaps in a way ties with this discussion. So in other words, what is the challenge of the global citizen, of the critical global citizen today, in your opinion?
The critical global citizen today has to somehow harness democracy to elect good governments that provide education and equality for all. I think democracy is very, very important in this project, and I've always been a staunch supporter of democratic government. The solution to the problems of democracy, and heavens knows there are many problems of democracy and democracies around the world, but the solution to the problem is more and greater democracy. And today we have the possibility of referenda, we have digital technologies and social media which can facilitate and enhance democracy. What we need is new and thicker concepts of democracy to help make the global citizen feel actively engaged and informed as to what's going on.
Very interesting. And let's now focus on your interpretation of Foucault as a complexity thinker.
Sorry, Foucault as a complexity thinker has been central to my research and to my whole approach. I believe that Foucault offers real and deep insights into moving to a more sophisticated approach beyond liberalism, which is, in a sense, more liberal than liberalism, which defends a deeper conception of the liberty and rights of the individual. A Foucauldian approach, for me, has challenged many of the problems of foundational approaches in education and society. It's challenged essentialism. Foucault is adamantly opposed to essentialist notions that we have a fixed human nature, that we are beings of a certain type of nature. He's what's called non-anthropocentric. He gets rid of the idea of a fixed nature. The yardstick we should apply is the future, of course, is what is necessary to negotiate a future which is characterized by things like climate change, global pandemics, a growing population, causing huge problems of navigating the future. It's like, how do we get to the future? What is the mathematical equation of negotiating a fragile future where the interests of one and the interests of all depend on each other to a much, much greater extent in a world of rising population? Foucault is also social constructionist in terms of issues of identity and sexuality. He doesn't deny the materialities of biology, but these are still historical cosmological creations. We are thrown in history and cosmology. So as a complexity materialist, I position Foucault as, in a way, trying to quantumize social reality. He is continuous with the quantum and post-quantum revolutions, which happened in the early 20th century, with people like Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Schrödinger, Henri Poincaré, right through to Ilya Prigogine and this type of complexity scientist who was trying to reconceptualize science more in terms of a systems approach, less individualist, not so ontologically individualist as the Newtonian conception of science held it to be. And instead of emphasizing deterministic trajectories or determinism and predictability, the new systems scientists of the quantum area pointed out through a relational ontology, a more holist ontology, how in fact non-predictability and indeterminism, uncertainty, and chance become far more important as variables going forward. In other words, we do not know precisely how the future will unfold. And I think this degree of uncertainty raises the issue of human responsibility for the types of problems that we face. It certainly throws the anchor very much down in the interest of democracy. And I think democracy becomes very more important in a Foucauldian system. So continuous with quantum and post-quantum theory, seeing matter as dynamic, a relational ontology. But the payoff of this, if these sound like very big words, is that Foucault emphasizes novelty, indeterminism, uncertainty, non-predictability, non-linearity, and chance. So it's an overturning, if you like, of the central commitments of the Newtonian idea of science. Newton was too much focused on individual sort of atoms, particles, elements. Foucault pointed out that continuous with the quantum revolution, that relations, society, and social wholes were much more important. So complexity then defeats also naturalism of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, that we have natural fixed characteristics. And one of the problems of naturalism is that, you know, how do we decide what is the natural characteristics of man? It's been a problem for educationalists all the way through. Rousseau deciding that man was a noble savage, Hobbes deciding that man was competitive, nasty, and that it was a much more negative view of human nature. And Foucault saying, well, naturalist explanations which see human nature as fixed, as Aristotle saw it, are not particularly productive and are not really valid. So everything for Foucault became historical. And this, one of the payoffs of this is a Foucauldian approach is that it militates very much against fundamentalism in religion, fundamentalism in politics, fundamentalism in morality. And Foucault, in one of his introductions to Gilles Deleuze's book, wrote about the importance of a non-fascist lifestyle, where we must look for the degrees and elements of fundamentalism in ourselves. In a way, he takes this from Kant. Immanuel Kant held the view that we couldn't go beyond the world for us. We were locked to the finitude of the phenomenal world, and going beyond the world for us to the world, the thing in itself, as Kant called it, was a degree of fundamentalism which actually was not possible. And so Kant ruled out a lot of issues which we had to be agnostic over it. And I claim in my recent book, Constructing Foucault's Ethics, that even notions of God and religion, one must be agnostic rather than fundamentalist. It's fundamentalist to actually posit a very definite answer to religious and spiritual questions. So ontology, not therefore beyond history and discourse. Everything for Foucault is locked in this world, and this leads to a non-fundamentalist politics, a non-fundamentalist morality, a non-fundamentalist approach to religion. I think that's extremely important for education. We must be, and this, the consequence of this is we must be less arrogant, less perhaps self-assured, less convinced that we're right. And it in other words, you know, it has implications for the process of othering, of making negative stereotypes against other groups, and of being more tolerant, perhaps, to different groups and different theories. So Foucault is very influential in these ways, and I think the issue of fundamentalism is really important consequence of his sort of approach.
Very interesting. I'd like to link this interesting discussion to the next question. And the question is, in your opinion, what are the challenges of higher education in the current climate, in the current societal challenges? Some of them are climate change, terrorism, and many, many others, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you see these challenges affecting global higher education, and what are the fundamental challenges nowadays of higher education?
I think the challenges for higher education are to instill a valid and realistic approach to life skills, a non-fundamentalist education, to not treat education so much as giving people a meal ticket or reproductive of a market value for their degree, which enables us all to get jobs. I think the future is going to be very, very different. I think people don't understand, none of us perhaps understand fully how the future is going to be extremely different, because population, for example, was 2.5 billion people in 1950s to 7.6 billion people today. That's a threefold increase today, and 10 billion by mid-century. That is the estimate, or just under 10 million, about 9.7 billion people on the surface of the earth. This means, in one sense, that we're all standing much closer together.
Right.
Mathematically, on a finite amount of space, we are very much closer together. And the problems of climate change, the relations between the collective and the individual are going to change enormously as a consequence. There is, in a sense, a collective dimension to selfhood. Yeah. And this will become far more evident. It's becoming far more evident now under the pandemic, where traditional liberties and traditional ways of doing things have been compromised to some degree, altered in the interests of a pandemic, where the relations between the one and the many are changing drastically. And I think also higher education will have to become more concerned with the global common good and make people, give people a greater sense of responsibility towards that, rather than to our own careers and how we can benefit from it ourselves. So instead of self-interest, we're going to have to become public interested. We're going to have to be less fundamentalist, as I said a few moments ago with relation to Foucault, in that fundamentalism is a form of essentialism. It really says we know what the reality is, and other people who don't share our view are somehow vastly mistaken. It leads to all sorts of violence and conflict between people. So fundamentalism is a problem, I think, also for liberalism, and that will have to become a concern of higher education. It's not that we also must not be idealistic. And I've drawn this also from Foucault. There is no sense that the world is going or bending towards a more just future.
Right.
The future is very uncertain, and it could go in lots of different ways. It could be violent and conflictual. It could go downhill rapidly, or with effort, we could sustain a version of life on Earth. But that is not given. It's not a given. And Foucault, in this sense, is not an idealist. He doesn't think that the moral and political universe is bending automatically towards justice. He very much leaves it as an open question. So there's no natural teleology or standards of perfection, as the old liberals used to say. There's no happy ending story that's inevitable in this sense. So I think this is where, the implications for higher education is it's going to, people's jobs are going to alter radically.
Yeah.
The idea of having a job will alter radically. Already we've seen under this pandemic an enormous number of people have given up the idea of having a permanent job. And I think we're going to have to re-gear society in a way that we've never really contemplated to ensure that everybody has the means of subsistence, whether they have a job or don't have a job, and that people contribute in the capacities for which they're best fitted. Mm-hmm. So in this sense, I think higher education will have to adapt very much to be a non-commodified option for people in the future.
Right. I think we touched on several interesting concepts. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the notion of justice, social justice, global justice. And so toward the end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you a last but central question. And so you mentioned that globalization must be based on social justice. And also, this is a question within a question. So in reality, are two interconnected questions. So the first one, as I just say, is the relationship between globalization and social justice. But we also discussed notion of global citizenship, cosmopolitan education. And so the second question is, how would you foresee a type of education, global citizenship education, cosmopolitan education oriented towards social justice today?
Yes, I think there'll have to be radical changes to the infrastructures and to the systems of society in order for global justice to have any chance today. I think that people are feeling, to some extent, estranged and alienated from partly because of climate change, partly because of global pandemics. I think a summary of problems: you've got population growth, you've got terrorism, you've got climate change, pandemics, you've got the fact that the present model of the economy is not particularly well geared to sustain life going forward into the future, which is going to have to be very different. You know, the Nestle company advised the US government not too long ago, released in the WikiLeaks papers, that water shortages by mid-century will become an issue of conflict between governments and peoples. And fresh water, which is absolutely indispensable to life, is being misused at the moment. About 70% of water reserves are used for animal agriculture. You have an emphasis on agriculture, mainly cow farming, cattle farming, for example, for the fast food industry. And whether these are sustainable going forward, certainly they can justify it in terms of demand. There's huge demand in Canada, the US, and Europe for this sort of food at the moment. Whether it's compatible with a vision of a sustainable future under climate change. Cows emit CO2. Land use is hugely contributing to deforestation, for example, in the Amazon rainforest. And all of this for an industry which is not particularly geared towards the public good or the public global good, but is geared more to the profits of large multinational capitalist enterprises. You have a lot of problems in relation to this. I don't think it's going to be a question, as the old Marxists used to say, of getting rid of capitalism and initiating socialism. It's more going to be a system of adapting what we have and of increasing controls over capitalism by the state on behalf of the people as capitalist concerns get bigger in size and profit. Right. They will have to introduce much more progressive taxation structures, but also I believe they will have to increase their stakes in control, ownership, and participation as companies, proportional to companies getting bigger in size and profits. Mm-hmm. At the lower level, so far, many people believe capitalism has been quite productive of innovation, liberty. It provides for liberty. It's educative to a certain extent. It throws up leaders, people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg. Whatever you think about them, no one can deny that they have talent, even if it's simply talent at making money. So in this sense, capitalism has a lot of positives, or in terms of a cost benefit analysis, I think it's quite productive at the lower levels. Once capitalist concerns get middle-sized and bigger, they do need guidance by the state. The public good is going to weigh down more heavily upon them. It already is in terms of climate change, in terms of pandemics, in terms of the needs of people and of the sustainability of the environment and ecology. So I think we're going to see vast changes in this area. And these are going to be brought about by need, by what is absolutely required for the survival of the human race and the project of humanity as we know it. You also have problems, I think, of terrorism. And I believe, if I can just say my worth on existing foreign policy, that going after terrorists with drones is not a particularly profitable foreign policy initiative, because as many people have said, it tends to produce more terrorists than it dispenses with. They may be able to kill a terrorist, and the collateral damage on the community, on their family, and on others actually produces hundreds more terrorists who suddenly develop as a result. So I think the current war on terror has not been particularly bent on social justice. The only long-term effect on social justice is a campaign of justice, of global justice, towards people who somehow and very mistakenly feel dispossessed. And terrorism is a mistaken reaction to disaffection and feeling dispossessed.
So how would you connect this to education itself in terms of, for example, how would you frame 2 or 3 key core characteristics of education, a global citizenship education, cosmopolitan education oriented towards social justice? Might be a challenging question, but interesting for the audience, I believe.
All right. Well, I think we need to get back to an old principle, which was announced by people like Thomas Jefferson, of education being free, universal, and secular for all people. And I think the emergence of private education models have had an exclusionary effect. They've meant differences in quality of education. I think, secondly, education should be aimed more for life schools and for issues of accountability and responsibility to the global public good. This is going to be a big change. Instead of living for ourselves, people are going to have to live for humanity, for the public good. The problems are just so great in the global community at the moment, is that people are going to have to, as they are indeed, coming up to the mark, live, to help resolve global problems such as climate change. So education is going to have to become more orientated towards life skills and the global responsibility and the responsibilities associated with. Social and political responsibility and sensitivity to the public good, therefore, should become a major reorientating norm guiding public education. So adherence to global norms has been established over 200 years with respect to children's rights, women's rights, workers' rights. These are hard fought for rights, and they've become embodied and enshrined in the norms of the global world, and they're going to have to be consolidated and reinforced as well.
Right. Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much, Mark. This was a very interesting conversation, and I believe we were able to touch on very interesting themes and notions that are relevant to this interview series. I believe we discussed global justice quite comprehensively. We touched on your very interesting work on Foucault and all the philosophy behind it. And we also were able to frame some of the major challenges for higher education and education itself. So I really want to thank you for joining this interview series on global citizenship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.